demented at the moment, but here, yes. And delighted to be here. Really happy to be here. I am sorry, I do have an eye problem, and I've elected not to wear my eye patch that I usually wear these days. So if I have to, I'm going to have to squint sometimes, and I may repeat myself when I read some things to you, but I will do the best I can. And also, it's the ghost of Emily Post, because she had very severe eye problems. Of course, so naturally, this happened to me halfway through. And she actually went to out to the Seeing Eye Dog Farm in New York State when she was told that her cataracts might make her go blind. And that kind of, I don't know, gutsiness and determination to just deal with what life gives you really helped me when I started having the eye problems, which in my case is lymphoma left over from the brain. But the point is, when I actually started thinking, what if I went blind with this? I thought, well, you know, if she could do it, then so could I. And I know that sounds silly and sentimental, but I guess that's what role models mean. But I thought, okay, but in my case, it wasn't going to be dogs. I decided Braille would be, you know, easier for me. But we may not have to go that route. But I should be wearing the eye patch. So I'm sorry if I stumble. I was in Atlanta. I was just thinking about this when I was 20 years old, and a girlfriend who was going to Emory, I was from Florida, a girlfriend asked me to come up and go to Ebenezer Baptist Church with her. And so I did, and Daddy King was preaching that day. We were the only two white people in that entire congregation. And it was one of those extraordinary moments that has always stayed with me, which convinced me that moments in time really can alter our reality, our consciousness. These people were so friendly and welcoming, at the same time not really that aware of our presence at all, because they were into their own thing and full of energy and passion. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, this time they're all a different color than I am, and yet I feel really comfortable. I mean, it was kind of like one of those weird things that goes on. And so I think it's really significant, I mean, in a very personal way, that I was here last night when listening to the television reports and so forth, when I kind of saw in one sense the culmination of a lot of the activity that the Kings promoted. So I'll never forget again this night, if only because the way these things all connect. Only connect, as Forster always said, only connect. Well, somewhat in the spirit of that, I thought that, I was reflecting upon the times now, and Emily Post was, even though she was brought up right after the Civil War ended, she was actually born just a couple years later, and people don't realize that because she died in 1960. So that's a real span of life that you are influenced by the Civil War, and her parents were very definitely, raised her with that background. But you yourself die right after Sputnik's taken off and everything. It's quite a span. And so maybe in a way it makes sense that a woman who at 50, and don't forget this was before More magazine, this is before 50 was cool. This was back when 50 in 1922 was over. I meant your life was done, right? So she was 50 when she wrote Etiquette. And it was 1922, which was about the stupidest time her sons told her to even think about writing a book about etiquette, right? The 20s. And so I thought I would start by kind of putting her back in 1883 when she moved from Baltimore. She had moved from Baltimore with her family. Her father was a famous up-and-coming architect, and he did become quite famous, Bruce Price. And her mother brought the money into the family from the coal in Wilkes-Barre. And so then they moved to Manhattan when she was about 5. But she never lost the the Southern Belle thing was very important to her, and she would go back to Baltimore often for her cousins' ceremonies. And debutante balls and things like this. But she also maintained, she and her family in Manhattan, they were welcomed into, the Vanderbilt and Astor Society, but in fact, they were always a little dubious, a little removed, feeling that it was too gilded. I guess that would be the way to put it. So they were of it, but not really of it, which turned out to be very useful for her when she was, later in later life reflecting upon what she thought was ethical or not. And she was getting the experience that of the highest classes in America, but she was also seeing through her parents' eyes the downside of that. One of the friends that moved to Manhattan also right after her family did was named Frank Hopkinson Smith. He was he wrote a couple novels that were well received at the time. He was an architect that did some credible buildings. He would paint in the south of France, and he just kind of I guess a dilettante, except that's too negative a description of him. But everyone loved him, and even when you read the obituaries in 1915 when he died, it's just that practically New York City closed down. They loved him so much. But he was close friends in Baltimore with Emily's father, so when he moved to New York, they all got together quite often. And she became like Emily Post's second father. In fact, until I almost had finished the book, I assumed he had never married, because in all of her accounts of him, you would think she's the only child ever in his life. And in fact, he had a very happy family of 3 or 4 children of his own and his wife, and they were all close, but she really liked to sequester her memories as if she was, the princess or whatever. So, Uncle Frank, as she called him, or Hop, was chosen to build the foundation of the Statue of Liberty in 1883, which was, a big honor. And he asked Bruce, Emily's father, if he could take Emily out with him in the boat as he built it. She seemed very interested, and Bruce was happy to do that. So she actually was involved from the beginning with the Statue of Liberty's building. So here we have something that welcomed immigrants, that was meant to signify, I guess, in one way, to use an old-fashioned term, the melting pot of America. And she was absolutely in there from the beginning. She played in the actual the statue itself, which I guess is still hollow. But while they were building it, she would play in it, and she later said that she thought of it as her private dollhouse. And even though I never found a reference in etiquette or anywhere else where she connected those moments to her interest in teaching immigrants and war brides and so forth how to act if they wanted to get along in society. I don't see how it's possible that something so pivotal and so formative at such a young age didn't have a huge impact on her. So I'm going to read just a few pages about that experience. This is in 1883. Almost daily, it seemed that Hop Smith, for Uncle Frank, his name appeared conspicuously in the city newspapers, as if he were as important as Lady Liberty herself. The concrete support for Liberty Leading the People, the official name, would cost the government $8.94 per cubic yard. Now, I'm going to stress these numbers because this was an age where, during the Gilded Age, where numbers were king, and certainly not queen. They were king, and so numbers were used to signify the importance of any event. The end of the 19th century was an era of numbers, an age devoted to codifying and classifying, when calculations were next to godliness. Expenses were meticulously detailed for the public. Frank Smith's base required $51,000 to $5,200,000, in those terms, of concrete composed of sand, cement, and broken stones. It would measure 93 square feet at the bottom and 70 feet at the top, and stand 48 feet 8 inches high. The pedestal, rising to an altitude of 112 feet, would require a 67-foot square platform at the base and 40 at the top. Reciting the numbers reinforced the statue's significance. Who would have thought so many layers compiled the Statue of Liberty's foundation? From the beginning, Hopp installed Emily Price at his side. She joined him in a small tugboat as he inspected Miss Liberty's support material, sharing with her his sketches for the base, as if Emily's intelligence justified adult respect. Hopp Smith served as mentor at a key moment in the almost 12-year-old, she would always remind her mother whenever she said 11, almost 12-year-old girl's life. As Hopp and Emily toured his work in progress several times a week, the girl strutted proudly. While the statue's foundation took form, Emily was allowed to explore to her cavernous secret rooms in the monument's hollow interior. The experience turned out to be an idea fixe in the making. She pretended she was a princess, the strange edifice her castle, a not entirely singular fantasy for young girls, it nonetheless took hold of her imagination with a ferocity that her other memories rarely inhibited throughout her life. Contributing to the literal foundation of what was to be her country's welcome to strangers, eager to be Americans, affected Emily deeply. That she worshipped Frank Hopkinson Smith, second only to her father, Bruce Price, made for a potent combination, liberty and a second father she adored. In her later spill of vivid memories of Smith, she never mentioned his children or his wife. If readers of Emily Post's life relied on her anecdotes alone, they would assume Uncle Frank was a lifelong bachelor, devoted to his ersatz daughter in lieu of his own family. Yet his long-term marriage and lifetime devotion to his children were singled out in all the elegies devoted to him years later. Bruce proudly observed Emily's interest, her father, in understanding Miss Liberty from an architectural perspective. After all, he was an architect, as well as her awe when he was invited, Bruce Price, to stand on the die during the statue's eventual dedication. No small honor. Spurred on to allow his precocious daughter to accompany him to otherwise all-male construction sites, he felt responsible for Hopp's obvious success with Emily. Given this most recent evidence of her talent, he was even willing to forfeit the masculine solidarity he was accustomed to in order to educate his girl. Throughout her adulthood, in an odd absence of larger cultural reflection, Emily would wistfully reflect upon Bruce's sadness that her gender denied her the chance to become an architect herself. She so clearly had a talent for this kind of work. What a pity that she'd been born a girl, he said more than once. Had she been a boy, she could have become his partner and eventual successor. Without ever pondering the motivation for choices that she made as an adult, Emily would set out to prove to herself, most of all, that she was a worthy heir to Bruce Price. She always wanted to be an architect, and in fact, finally wrote a book about architecture when she was about 60, Personality of a House. And she, in one of the a pivotal review she gave at that time, she said, of all the things I always wanted to be, including an actress and a banjo player, and she was good at both, I most of all wanted to be an architect. But she could have been, and this is very typical of Emily Post, and in the long run, good for us, but she was not the first, she was not a path blazer, somebody who went first. She always went second. You know, she would wait and let someone else experiment, and then she would become brave. And often she got the credit as a result instead of the first person. It's not that she tried to take it, it's just that's how these things happen. In fact, by the time she thought seriously about a career, there were already women architects, however small their number. In 1886, Louise Bethune, whom some said was the first professional female architect anywhere, had become a member of the prestigious AIA, the American Institute of Architects. Some journalists claim that Bethune's birthplace, a small town in the center of New York State, had spurred her to achieve. She grew up next door to Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott had conducted the first women's rights convention in 1848. In October 1881, when Bethune opened an architectural office in Buffalo, she ensured that the occasion coincided with the presence of the state's Women's Congress in town. Nor were women limited to artistic fields. In 1884, Belva Ann Lockwood, a well-known suffragist and lawyer from Washington, D.C., 20 miles south of Emily's Baltimore home, ran for President of the United States, and again in 1888. She received an astounding 4,000 votes, and of course from men because only they could vote. But if enlightened attitudes towards gender, slowly working their way into the American psyche, if they were, atonement for slavery and subjugation of black people seemed headed in the opposite direction. The same year that news about the Vanderbilt class warfare temporarily outstripped interest in maneuvering Miss Liberty to harbor, the Vanderbilts were arguing about who was going to be the chief among them and who should be called Mrs. Vanderbilt and which one should be Mrs. William Vanderbilt, and the people of the upper classes were constantly chattering about this. Emily got sick of it. In fact, even her mother got involved. The same year that this had taken away the interest of people getting Miss Liberty to harbor, which for a while was the big newspaper topic, the Ku Klux Klan, nearly 20 years after its founding, was accelerating its efforts to cleanse America. Such extremism she would have abhorred, and offered the chance, tried to squelch it. But ugly, radical factions were not what shaped Emily Price Post's careless consideration of racial minorities. That culprit, a failure of intellectual sophistication, was more subtle. Throughout the decades, she would unfold her ambivalence about upper-class superiority into her belief in giving everyone a fair shake. People of color had to play by the same rules as everybody else. In America, men and women, girls and boys, all had an equal opportunity to learn how to behave. As the idea of inherited class eroded throughout the 20th century, Emily would breathe a sigh of relief. Now, and this is of course naive, but it's a kind of prototypical libertarian position of the time, which there's a lot to be said for it. Now there was no contesting the idea that quality could be had by anyone who wanted it badly enough. In light of her birth, Emily Price should have grown up in an era where the prejudices of her parents would soon become a thing of the past. After all, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was written 3 years after she was born. It outlawed racial discrimination and public accommodations, a major step in promoting equal coexistence. But instead of life steadily improving for former slaves among black citizens, in 1883, so this is 8 years later, a conservative Supreme Court took the extraordinary step of rescinding the landmark legislation passed when Emily was a toddler. Separate but equal coexistence established by Plessy versus Ferguson would remain the law of the land until the 1960s. Now, Emily went through, she married as she was supposed to, a dashing young man, and he squandered her fortunes. He came from, in those days often, especially in the Gilded Age, you would get one partner would have the name and the prestige and the background, the family, and the other partner would have the new wealth. And so that's, that there were so many movies done about that in the last 10 years, but before that, many, many novels. So so she married Post, and there was great lineage there, and certainly they didn't come from the coal fields like her mother did and get their wealth. But the wealth definitely came from the coal. And her mother was a very practical woman who therefore was not taken in so much by the New York society, because she knew that, that people had to get their hands dirty to make money, usually on some generation, even if it's a couple away. And Bruce Price was, I guess, more classically a gentleman. His father was a lawyer in Baltimore who was close to Abraham Lincoln, and I found some letters between Lincoln and Bruce's father, basically giving carte blanche. Lincoln, during the Civil War, said to Bruce's father, "Any prisoner that you want to pardon, it's done. You just do it as you want." And I was talking about this in my writers group, and one of the writers who's a lawyer said, that's extraordinary, the kind of carte blanche he gave him throughout the war. And in fact, when Washington Price died, Bruce's father, Emily's grandfather, Baltimore shut down for the day and, held mourning and so forth. So this is the background she came from on the one hand, and then and Bruce married the coal baron's daughter, who was very practical. And Emily herself ended up meshing both of those personalities, the idealistic and the idea that, you have to work for a living. And the marriage of her parents was apparently quite happy and successful. They each had their domains, and they did what they were supposed to do. But it didn't work out that way for Emily. She thought it would, and then she had been on the stage a lot before she got married, and the amateur stage in Tuxedo Park, an exclusive enclave their father built in New York. And Edwin Post saw her and was dancing with her when she came out, her debutante ball at Delmonico's in New York City, and I suspect married her because she suited his needs. I think she fell in love with him very much, and because for about a year after their engagement was announced, she disappeared from society, and her parents announced that she was sick and that the engagement was off. But there's no evidence she was sick. I think that Post's father was declaring bankruptcy at the time. And I'm sure that Emily's parents were very suspicious of the family she was marrying into. But finally, everything, I don't know how they resolved it, but she was allowed to marry Post, and they married. And immediately she stopped her acting and the things that gave her joy, because at that time you were supposed to. She didn't regret it. She thought that's what married women did, mothers did. She commanded her cooks, her staff of 8. That took a lot of her time up, especially they had these terrapin and duck dinners, like four a week for socialites around the city. And I read one account that said that the terrapin tasted terrible, for everybody, because you'd have to soak it in so much sherry to give it any flavor, and it was stringy. It's confusing why it was such a big hit, but it was. So that was her new life, and she had 2 sons, and her husband continually cheated on her and took her money. And at one point, he got caught by the local New York City briber who typically would catch some highfalutin social person and then go to the person and say, "If you'll pay me, $500, then I'll include you in my book about social figures whenever I decide to write it. More importantly, this information won't be leaked to the paper." And so they all did. They just paid him off. It was kind of a big racket. Well, when Emily's husband got caught, for some reason, and she made up reasons later to excuse it, I think, but he went public. And I think the reason he did it was he wanted out of the marriage, because why else surely there was money to pay the guy off. And he said he went public and set up a sting, in the bathroom of in the restroom of one of the big hotels in New York City. Did the sting all over the New York Times front page for, all summer long. And when he walked into the stock market where he worked, the stock exchange, everybody stood up and cheered and said he was a hero. Now, go and get the bastard. That's what I remember, one quote. Oh, we're so proud of you. But Emily Post was devastated. She had been brought up believing that you never aired such things publicly, and a lot of her friends had devised marriages where they went their separate ways. They just did it discreetly. I mean, the women not sexually, obviously, at that time, but the men sexually. In fact, that part of the problem was, for that period of about 20 years, it was assumed that women, do you remember that expression that women were supposed to close their eyes and think of Queen Victoria? Remember that? Virginia Woolf talked about that. But so she didn't expect pleasure from her sexual relationship. Once she had the children, she assumed that her husband would find such pleasure elsewhere, and she wasn't interested in it. But there was supposed to be discretion, nobody getting hurt. And for whatever reason, her husband wanted to bring this to the public, and he said he wanted to be heroic and stomp out this terrible blackmailer. She actually tried to reconcile with him even after all this. I found some evidence that she did, and he spent the weekend with her in Tuxedo Park and went to the parties, but then he left. And she never, to the end of her life, I should tell you this because people don't believe it and they always ask me, I might as well say it. I don't think she ever again had sex. She was 34 and very attractive at her kind of height then, I guess, and she was not interested in women. Believe me, I tried very hard to prove that she was, and she wasn't. I say that because I'm asked constantly by reporters and by reviewers, and she couldn't have just gone her whole life, given, especially she had plenty of opportunities without ever being intimate again, and she did. She found what she needed through her career eventually, and through her servants, who she always had 6 or 7. They were devoted to her, but she paid them well, she treated them well, and they served as friends when she wanted friends. Then when she didn't, it's like having a pet, I guess, they were gone, and she liked a lot of solitude. In a way, there's a sense in which Martha Stewart and Oprah both kind of re-embody the sort of multimedia person she became, and had at some level felt they couldn't do it with somebody intimately at their side. Emily ended up, getting a radio show, getting a syndicated newspaper column, all of this, and magazine column. So, and she worked all the time. So I guess really in the context of those days, there's no way she could have been married. And I don't think it would have occurred. She just didn't have the framework, again, to even think of other solutions or possibilities. So I'll just read one more thing, which is the penultimate, I guess not penultimate, the ultimate moment when she decided at age 50 that she would write a book about etiquette. Now, she had written 4 novels, and they were quite successful and had gotten reviewed in the New York Times. And, she was known as not amateur, but a second-rate novelist, and she could be proud of it. She sometimes had good sales and so forth. They were usually romance novels, often about a husband who didn't appreciate or love his wife enough until it was too late. But now, after World War I, she had done this, done that. Her sons were grown. One son was a war hero, one of the first shot down over France, and but they were both back now, and they were safe. And she was bored. So it's about 1920, and she didn't know what to do. And she went to dinners still with literary friends, Condé Nast and Frank Crownshield, who was the editor at the time of Vanity Fair, and so this is what proceeded. This is, I would say, 1920. again, think of what that means, what's being presaged in terms of the Roaring Twenties. Her sons tried to discourage her from this new project. The flamboyance of the early 20s, they believed, hardly appeared an ideal time for yet another book on manners. There were tons of them every year, like 20 would come out. In spite of Frank Crownshield's enthusiasm, they themselves knew no one who would buy such a book. Emily appreciated their advice. The flappers and the petting parties, eager to create their own rules, seemed unlikely to engender a run on etiquette manuals, she admitted. Ned and Bruce worked hard to persuade their mother that her timing was way off, further arguing that for an already established author to write an etiquette book was surely a step down from her previous work. Their skepticism was well placed for more than one reason. After all, Sigmund Freud and Havelock Ellis filled the popular press these days, boldly asserting that the sexual nature of the female, who it turned was relieved to shuck her Victorian caisons. Defiantly uninhibited, these liberated women sought new, not old representations of what they were and what they wanted to be. Everything from dress lengths to hairstyles was abbreviated. Women, the primary consumers and the purveyors of etiquette, were currently otherwise engaged. An age of gangsters and speakeasies and flat-chested women seemed entirely out of Emily Post's domain. But Ned and Bruce's seemingly easygoing mother, more strategic than even they realized, was convinced that change was endemic to culture. As she had witnessed her sons and their cohorts readjusting to civilian life, she had accurately gauged a renewed opportunity. Not only were increasing numbers of immigrants hungry to learn how to become well-bred Americans, wartime brides and their husbands confronted a home front whose landscape had shifted radically in the past 4 or 5 years. The war had sent 2 million soldiers back from Europe, many of whose tour of duty had opened their youthful eyes to freer sexual mores abroad. Even prohibition, paradoxically, had furthered a cultural revolution, creating disgusted citizens whose defiance actually helped double the number of illegal saloons in New York during the early 20s. Emily saw her opening, and that summer of 1920, she either asked Frank Crownshield to broker a deal. She lied about this, so we don't really know how it happened, so I'm just putting things together. She either asked or she jumped at the chance he'd already offered her. She would compose a book about how to behave. Seated on a high stool in front of her father's drafting table, she in effect wrote of and from her own life. Humble enough to realize she lacked expertise in this area or that, she occasionally embarrassed herself with her enthusiasm, so carried away that she grilled everyone around her to supplement her own knowledge. A substantial portion of etiquette came from Emily's polling friends, family, even customers waiting for taxis. But this was the age of the lost generation of writers, such as Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who were convinced that the old values had rotted to their core. This side of paradise serenaded the Jazz Age and Coed, while the Great Gatsby would lament its decline. It was not surprising that her sons were convinced she was out of touch. Etiquette was a hit. In March 1923, 8 months after its publication, Emily's little blue book, as she self-deprecatingly referred to it at first, it was 700 and something pages, would finally top Publishers Weekly sales list for nonfiction, having occupied 2nd to 5th place throughout the fall of 1922 and staying in 4th place for much of the following year. Its author was in good company. Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt took the honors on the fiction list. And Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence was still selling strong 2 years after its publication. So you think of it. Babbitt, about the businessman, harassed businessman of America, The Age of Innocence, which of course looked back, and Etiquette. This triumvirate of the modern moment, nostalgia, lacerated by a sharp-eyed honesty, made odd but perfect sense. Mrs. Wharton skewered society, while Lewis lacerated the joyless businessman. Emily Post would represent the truth of their fiction, her prose teaching the country that manners, in the end, mattered even more than money. She went on to, she also used, and this is where other good writers didn't have this advantage, because she had self-studied so hard to write her novels, she actually used a lot of kind of characters as if it were Restoration drama. She named her characters. And to this day, I still run into writers who tell me, authors who say, just like my experience, when I was young, my family didn't have much money, but we had this Emily Post book in the living room, and when it was rainy, I would take it off the shelf and read it. And in that book, I learned all about these exotic things, about the not-quites, that was one couple, the top-lofties, the eminents, Mr. and Mrs. Eminent, this is the best, or the rich and vulgars. They were the worst. And they were all composites of her acquaintances. The big point that she made, though, her heroes and her overwrought villains implicitly acknowledged the fiction that was always at the base of best society. And as she revised the book about every 5 to 7 years, really until the end of the 50s, right before she died. And every time, this was the most interesting thing, you would notice that she let loose of the idea of best society being something that either we're born with, or that ever comes from money, or she got more and more expansive and liberal in her thinking, and she, early on, she would contradict herself, telling people best society is you being aware of other people, best society, but later on she would say something that seemed to contradict that. The older she got, there was more consistency in what she meant by best society, which was certainly not a matter of heredity or a nationality or anything like that. She even ended up saying a best society, let me read this. Though her book frequently invoked a mythical, sometimes contradictory best society of best people, she knew there was no hereditary ruling class in the United States. The leveling ideals of a democracy funded its very foundation. Her heroes and her overwrought villains implicitly acknowledged the fiction at the base of best society. And she actually said, best society is not a fellowship, nor does it seek to exclude those who are not of exalted birth, but it is an association of gentle folk in which charm of manner and instinctive consideration for the feelings of others are the credentials by which society, the world over, recognizes its chosen members. She made the point, too, that I keep remembering every time something threatens to happen that's disastrous. If you're having a party, for instance, and somebody breaks your finest china by carelessness or whatever, the only choice you have is to assuage the hurt, the worry of the person. No, don't worry, it's nothing, as you clean it up, regardless of what you're thinking. If somebody knocks something on your dress, in fact, this happened to her, cranberries on a white dress, and you're about to speak, and I've thought about this often. I thought, if this happened to me, how would I handle it? And I thought, the truth is, it's once you in essence confess it, and you say to people, oh, I had an accident, I got something here on my dress, then it's over. You may hate the fact of how much you spend on the outfit, but, and to wittingly cause distress to others was to her the antithesis of good manners. It was not the number of how you use the forks or whatever. In fact, she made the point, and I started experimenting, seeing if this is true, and it is, that good manners is always about making things easy for everybody. So, for instance, we talk about passing everything one way at the table, because if you ever try to not do it one way, everything's going all over the place. It's not a nice way to eat dinner, or to try to. And she said, when people write me all the time saying, what am I supposed to do with all these forks? I say, number one, just watch somebody else. Number two, if you don't use the right fork, it's really not a big deal if you think it shows that you're not of a certain class, the way you conduct yourself. And for instance, if you put your elbows out like this, the reason that's considered classless, if that's obviously a wrong word, but it's because it's inconvenient to the person next to you. It takes up too much room. It's not practical. And she kept returning to that word practical. Imagine if everyone's sitting at a table like this as they ate, and there's no, so she said that's why. And someone, a newspaper reporter said, I remember reading an interview where she said, I noticed you sitting at that dinner during dessert with your elbows on the table. And she said, well, why wouldn't I? There was no problem, there's plenty of room. We're all, it was relaxing. And the person was clearly taken aback. And it's very odd, if you go through the reviews through the years, people have attributed, and they continue to do this, to Emily Post the responsibility for all these rules that she in no way endorsed. She really believed that etiquette was all about making life more graceful, making it easier. Back in the somebody pointed out that at the turn, I guess it was in the 1860s in New York, men had to be taught not to spit as they walked, because it hit the ladies' skirts in front of them, and it would, and things like that were just practical manners, and it gets translated into tickets for society, but it's always from a practical, from something that mattered. I don't know if you've ever done this, but increasingly, I think as people don't care about the protocol itself anymore, the problem with it is I find myself forgetting, if I'm at a dinner, whose cup is that, or whose bread plate is that? And if one person does it wrong, I've got my system now where I go solids on the left, liquids on the right, and then I always remember. But if somebody does it wrong, then the whole thing's, you don't know if you're supposed to use, should you say nicely, oh, I think you have my plate, or do you just go ahead? It's just a matter of making things smooth, Okay, so just about finished here. To wittingly cause distress to others was to Emily the antithesis of good manners. Throughout the decades, in the face of countless changes, the central commandment to put others at their ease would remain constant. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the agnostic etiquette expert maintained. One's clumsy guests, for instance, must be made comfortable over any mishap their carelessness might have caused. The girl who had pouted, I do have to tell you, though, about the one thing she was pretty severe about, language. She really felt that people were, whether unfairly or not, they were discriminated against if they used really what she called illiterate pronunciations. She said, regional accents are great wherever you live. That's lovely. But to say things like family instead of family, or she said picture instead of picture. What's another example she gave? The opposite, where people were trying to sound what they assumed was higher class, so they would say issue instead of issue. Or they pronounced Paris with the trilled R's and the hissing S's. So those things really made her wince, and she said, you can't, don't do this. Just learn how the American pronunciation is preferred, learn how to do it, and then use your regional accent, and it's lovely. But don't say things that, don't mispronounce the word and think that's okay. It just makes you sound like you don't care, you don't know, or whatever. She hated things like those crooked little fingers when people, they drink tea and they put their finger up. She never understood that, although people still think she wanted, I mean, I still read references to Emily and her little finger, and I don't know how. High handshaking, I never quite understood that. I guess people at some point thought it was, they would reach up higher to, she thought that all affectations were bad form. She hated particularly bovine continuation. This, instead of saying cow's tail, she was incredulous that anybody could think that was, good English. But it's funny because I was thinking that, today we probably actually could find medical use of that for, what is it, collagen or Botox or whatever. Botox, you could say bovine, one of them is made from, is a bovine product, right? A cow product. You could say bovine continuation will cost much more. I could see using that now, but it shows you how times change, and so what was affected one time, because, one era. Even more than overreaching through ignorance, Emily was deeply offended by the pretentious or the pompous, as she disparaged particularly the supposed omniscience of the very rich. Nonetheless, she had her consistent inconsistencies. As one otherwise admiring critic lamented, even though she declared few rules of etiquette to be inelastic, she herself weighted etiquette down, and this is true right till the end, with you. You must never do this. You should always do this. And so, obviously, she had a few absolutes left in her psyche somewhere. I'll go ahead and finish here. The girl who had pouted when denied the stage, when her mother made her get off the stage because she was too good at it and she might run off, like the actresses at the time, and that they were always the bad women. The girl who had pouted when she was denied the stage was a self-possessed woman come full circle. She had got her chance, after all, to be famous. This time, however, her narcissism would work to the good of others, as she freely dispensed her knowledge and the fruits of her background. Emily Post's genuine, if confused, respect for all people registered on page after page of etiquette. The subject hardly mattered. Funeral or flower arrangements, broken hearts or broken glass, Emily held her audience in esteem, and she meant to teach her readers, would-be best people, whatever their background, race, or creed, to do likewise. Tellingly, as the book's best society became more elusive with each revision, it also became more egalitarian. But etiquette's principle of practicality remained the same. If you wanted to belong, if you wanted to get ahead and join the best people, you needed to know the rules. Good manners open many doors that money will never move, an advertisement for etiquette claimed several years after its initial publication. The 1922 publication of Etiquette, and the whole name went like this, Etiquette in Society, in Business, in Politics, and at Home, was an epochal moment. On an average of every 5 years, a revised edition of those original 250,000 words would track the changing conventions, revisiting and re-envisioning society. Most extraordinary, the name Emily Post, associated with elegance, would nevertheless signify the democratization of manners into the next century. And there she is. Yes. Yes, yes, right.
What do you think she would say about life today?
Right. That's a very interesting question. It's funny, it just came up recently in a different way, but you're right. That's exactly what was going on then. When she wrote about these subjects, she said it was always better to stay on neutral topics unless you absolutely knew the feelings, because feelings could become so impassioned and the whole evening could be made negative, and people would be hurt, and it would end up a disaster. So that was her answer. And in one sense, when you say, what would she think today? I mean, I don't see how it changes. Every time I think that if I have an intelligent conversation with people who disagree with me, that we can remain civil and only impassioned and positive ways, intellectual ways, it degenerates very quickly. And unless we stop talking, there will be hard feelings at the end of it. So, and maybe that's just, that my friends or my incapacity to do it right. But I mean, I would think, and I think Peggy Post, if she were here, who's kind of taken up the banner of her great-great-grandmother-in-law, would say that unless you know the crowd, it would really be wiser not to go there, because what are you going to get from it, really, except distress people?
She started writing in 1922. She revised every 5 years.
Right.
She went through some changing times.
Right.
I mean, the Great Depression, World War II, and some other factors. I mean, she wrote up until the 1960s.
Right.
And the integration of the services.
Right.
And being born in Tuxedo Park, which is a rather cloistered thing, you mentioned that she got people on the streets opinion.
Right.
She really needed those people on the streets opinion in order to get into the real world, because not everybody is a Tuxedo Park.
Right.
And I just wanted to know, what would you say was her most unique thing that came out of each one of these revised editions every 5 years? She adjusted.
Well, first of all, as a kind of prelude to how she adjusted, don't forget that she knew that Tuxedo Park was cloistered, certainly by this time when she was 50. And in fact, by now, I think she'd already moved. She no longer would go there. She got her second residence in Martha's Vineyard instead, in Edgartown. But she knew it was time to leave, that, her time had passed there. But the way that she was very alert to, I called her with somebody, she was a sociologist, without the training, and she absolutely depended upon an informal sampling of what she considered all sorts of people. So she was in New York City most of the time, or at least 8 months of the year. So you've got quite a few people to choose from there, and she would apparently just stop people and talk to them. She was a very outgoing, friendly person, and she would just stop people and ask them questions. She would ask friends who they knew that could answer questions for her. And it was amazing, because you're absolutely right. That's in one way an undermined wisdom of having all of these volumes in terms of a sociologist who really wanted to go through this. It would have taken me another 5 years, but the changes going on in American history are always recorded. For instance, the war years you mentioned. She actually did 2 editions during the war years. And the second one, where I think it has at the end, maybe it's the 45 edition, but she put an addendum, and it tells you that you really should be careful when soldiers come home from war and they're missing a leg or an arm, that you wait to get the cue from them in terms of talking about it. The most important thing is you let the soldier know that you love them just the same. You're so happy, you're so proud of them, and if they want to talk, you're ready to talk, but you don't push them, you don't force them. You have to be sensitive. So those changes are very definitely included in every edition. In 1927, which is 5 years after she first did it, she made quite a few changes showing that she had really miscalculated the money issue. She said, it turns out that not all of you have 7 servants. In fact, some of you apparently, she said, only have 1. That's where she was. And she said, so she and her beloved son, who later tragically, the one who's going to become an architect like her beloved father, she recruited him to sit at a table and have a dinner party with Mrs. 3-in-1, as she called her solution, which was, in essence, I guess it'd be like a huge chafing dish today with different sides to it, and she put it under her feet, the table, and then she would tell her son what he could contribute, and between them they did the whole dinner party like this, and she wrote it up, and she became so famous, Mrs. Three-in-One. But she said, no, I don't think you should try a formal dinner, like for 8 people. You shouldn't do that or more, because this Mrs. Three-in-One's only good for, informal. I thought that's kind of how I entertain now anyway, so formal or not, made me feel bad. But she, again, that's a sign, though, too, of how she was aware of what, of how where the country was. She did grow up privileged, and I guess it takes a lot to realize just how elaborate all those servants can be. She always called her place in Martha's Vineyard. I was speaking there just a couple of days ago and went by it again. And it's a lovely, I have to use her word cottage, but it's a big place, and she built onto it for her grandchildren later on, and built you could walk through way. And she bought the lot next door to plant flowers. The whole lot is called a picking garden for her flowers. She didn't like a certain kind of red flower, they drive her crazy. She would be writing, and she'd look out and see the flower, and run outside to pull it up. But the flower garden saved her after her son tragically died at 30. Because I guess when you plant things, I did a lot of research on how immigrants use gardens to remind them of the countries they've left and so forth, and the food. And Dominique Browning, who used to be the editor of House and Garden, during her divorce, she said that the flower put her in touch with the sense she could make things grow, and that's what Emily Post obviously did. She, started. I mean, she had a gardener, of course, but I found the journal that she would send to the seed company in Philadelphia, and it was this incredibly detailed. I would like 3 green flowers here and 2 blue. She was, had the architectural mind, and it was just like that. And he would write her back very politely. But I've also often wondered, the president of that company, I've often wondered what he said to the people in his office every time he got her orders. She'd say, "Now the pink one didn't grow as well as the orange one next to it, which was half an inch taller." She was compulsive in her. I mean, that was definitely her. And then she decided red. The problem with red was it wasn't good for nature, but it was very good for artifice. And this came about during her trial, during her husband's trial. She started wearing red so people couldn't pity her. She looked like she wasn't sad or anything. And she kept wearing it. She finally ended up with something like 100 pairs of red shoes in her closet. That's what several of her friends and neighbors on Martha's Vineyard told me, so I guess it must be true. I thought, that's a real kind of obsession, is that, 100 red. She had very big feet, too. Yes, she sure. Maybe that's why, I don't know.
What inspired you to write about her, and how long did it take you to write?
It took me about 9 years, and but that's, I get irritated when writers will say, "I spent 20 years on this book," and the reviewers repeat it like it's so magical. But often they're teaching, or it's not as if they're spending every day 8 hours a day, and I was, because I had stopped teaching, and so it was very good. I could just work all day writing. And then in the middle of writing the book, I want to be honest, because it wasn't 9 years of this, but I suddenly started acting weird, apparently. I have no memory of this, and saying odd things and going to bed and sleeping all day. And my husband said, "I know you get tense when there are deadlines, but this is kind of odd." And then I suggested buying a turkey at the grocery store and pesto and taking them both to a church I'd never been to, and put in a collection plate. And then he knew something was wrong, and it turned out that I had a very serious malignant brain cancer, and I almost died from it, actually. But so that was its own trauma, and shock. and I was treated at Sloan Kettering for 6 months. So that's you have to go in for a week and then come out, and you certainly can't. I mean, at least with this kind of brain cancer, you can't write or think or read or anything except heal. So in any event, that's why I'm kind of defensive because my editor at Random House just wrote me and said, so let's talk about your next book. And I said, I just think I want to write a memoir. And she said, no, you owe us a big one, a big book, and we want a big one for the next one too. And so anyway, I'm very defensive. I want to say, it's not like I was lying around, just being lazy or something. But anyway, so that's how long it took. And I think ordinarily it would have taken me more like 4 or 5 years. It's really brilliantly written because it's so Emily Post is so passionate about her subject, and she speaks as equal, as if you're her equal no matter who you are. I mean, she really obviously believes this, which is, I think, unusual for writers, especially of etiquette books. And there were some at the time, by the way, that were very hip and cool and cute. And then there were some that were very stuffy. There were lots of etiquette books, but none hit this kind of tone, the writer's voice like this. And so anyway, I would read it when I was, it was raining outside, and I just really loved it. And I loved the world it conjured, especially the world of the balls. I liked that stuff, the Gilded Age. I wasn't reading the stuff about being kind to each other. I was into wow, these gowns, and wow. And then my mom used to make me and my younger sister practice our posture when we were little by walking across the living room, and luckily it was a small room, with that book on our head. And it's a heavy book, I mean, especially for a young child. And then she started this really irritating habit I was talking to my sister about the other day, and we laughed. She'd say, TTI, girls, TTI. And TTI meant tuck tummy in. She thought somehow it was less offensive if she said it like that or something, instead. So that was the kind of chant, the mantra of our childhood. So then then from that, leaping from there to how I got the idea of writing it, I think that I was talking to my husband about a list I'd seen in of the most influential women in the 20th century, and Eleanor Roosevelt was first, and then Emily Post was second, and I told him this story, and he said, so are there good biographies of her? And I said, well, I'm sure there are, but I actually, now that you mentioned, I've never read one. So I went to get one just because I was interested, and it was stunning to me that there wasn't any. And I should have known right then something was wrong because, I mean, she's a ripe subject, why wouldn't there be? It turned out that she had the log, she called it a log, it was really a diary, but that she kept throughout her life, and that, biographers always depend on that kind of thing. It's really crucial. Either right after she died, in this convoluted exchange, I think her son accidentally threw it away when he was coming back from Europe, and they destroyed afterwards all personal letters. It was their sense of decorum. Nobody thinking at the time that the people, because when she died, she had dementia, and at that point, her son just wasn't thinking that way. And so there were no papers. I mean, there were no papers, which is a biographer's nightmare. Even Shakespeare, you can. So I had to spend an awful lot of time finding a letter here in Indiana, a letter there from the agent, that in their archives that referred to Emily Post. And then I got some wonderful woman, the Angel, that these things happened, saw my inquiry in the New York Times, and she wrote me and said, I'm a researcher for the Brooklyn Historical Society, and I'd be happy to help you. And I said, well, how much will you charge? And she said, oh, no, I would just like to do this. I think it's an interesting project. And this woman, who was incredible, spent 4 years, compiling information for me from every newspaper where Emily Post's name had been mentioned, even in her parents back in the 19th century, and everything. I mean, it's just amazing. So without her, I don't know what I would have done. But this next book, whatever it is, will have to be easier. You know what I mean? Well, I guess you should never say that, but yes. In the United States? Yeah, well, what they usually did was pirate those, just reprint them in this country, and I'm sure she did. I mean, one of her favorites was, in addition to Wharton, Edith Wharton, because she and Wharton were actually different parties together, and it made her feel proud to be with, a really acknowledged writer, to be at the table and to be included in that company. But she liked, who's that? Mrs. Humphrey Ward? Yeah, Mrs. Humphrey Ward, her novels. I mean, pretty, what we would call today very B or C rate novels. They're almost always romances. I mean, imagine it. The women were living vicariously. That's about, of the Gilded Age, the upper class women, that's the only. You mean, in other words, the similarities? She, yes, and she plagiarized from several sources, and sometimes, I mean, what we would call today, it would put her in jail. She would just lift you can just find whole paragraphs, but at the time, that was, she thought it was stupid to waste her time rewriting something that was. Pardon? Well, yes, I definitely think she was, in the sense that obviously she was saying you know, those stiff and precise rules are not at the heart of it. So yes, I would agree that she was, but I'm just saying that there's a lot in 1922. I mean, you certainly see much of, for instance, who is that one? Emily Holt would be more the stronger etiquette influence, who wrote a book, a couple versions at the turn of the century that Emily really lifted quite a bit from, and I know her family used that etiquette book. So, but I mean, nobody thought to expose her. There was nothing to expose. It's just what you did then. It sounds so appealing now. It doesn't. You just lift what you want. Now we're so scared. It's so weird. And writing now, you know what is scary is, and I know the people in my group say this too. You'll write something and you copy it down because you've got a source, and you think, oh, I've got to remember to change this, and then you say to yourself, I better change it right now because I might forget, and then people will think I plagiarized. So then you change it, right? So then you're going back to revise, and you start to change it because you're revising, and you say, I might be changing it back to what it originally was. And it's true. Then you get all confused, and you say, oh man, it's going to look like I was just lifting. I can't remember what, it becomes very confusing.
We're really low on time.
Ah,
One more question?
okay, yes. You mean after she wrote etiquette? Yeah. That's a good question. By the time she wrote etiquette, she had already gone through that during the teens for 1920. Her friends in Tuxedo Park, and one of her best friends was J.P. Morgan's daughter, Juliet, would say to her, why are you doing this? At first you said you needed money because your husband left you and your blah, blah, blah. And that made sense. But now your mother's died, you've been left all this money, you don't have to do this anymore, so why don't you come out and play with us? And when she said, that's the point where she said, and this was in the teens, I actually don't want to. I love work. I love work, she said. And Juliet Morgan went her own way, and another woman who had moved to Tuxedo Park did become her lifelong friend. She actually ended up, her granddaughter marrying one of the Selznicks, Daniel Selznick, the movie people. and I've taught, and they've been wonderfully helpful about that period because they remember a lot of they're elderly and they remember a lot. And they've said that Catherine Collier, who was the aunt of Franklin Roosevelt, was actually very close and supportive of Emily's writing and of Emily throughout her post, 1920 from then on. And the other person was a very feisty woman whom she had known since she was a little girl. So, and these people remained her friends. So I think actually, as you asked that, I realized that her friendships evolved into seeking other kind of women than she had earlier. Okay.
I was wondering, you wrote great stuff about how this was both very key observers of the American.
Right, the scene, right.
What would you say that these two individuals may have in common from all your research? Have you thought about them
You know,
using each other?
yes, I have, yeah. I have, but only in the sense that the Rockwell. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. Have I found, in other words, a similar, the fact that I've done a biography of Norman Rockwell, Mr. Americana, and then Emily Post, I guess you could say Ms. Americana, in somewhat similar time periods. Have I found similarities or I guess differences too? There was what 20 years difference in those two, and the gender difference, and the fact that one was a graphic artist, and one was a word artist. I did not, believe it or not, until very late in the project of Emily Post, realize that I was, number one, moving into American specialties, which now I love. And I had done all my graduate work and my previous books in British Romanticism, which is a whole different, Shelley and Wordsworth. And I really regretted now, and I still do, that I hadn't done my work on 19th, 20th century American culture. I find it fascinating, So I didn't with Norman Rockwell. I stuck with the art and his own life. I did not integrate very much what was going on in the culture of the time. And some people prefer that. I got, the Stacy Schiff at the New York Times said the problem with this bio of Emily Post is she talks about things that are not directly related to Emily Post. And that's a choice. And I stuck to the text with Norman Rockwell. But I don't regret now, and I wish if I were to go back and do Norman Rockwell again, I would absolutely incorporate, just like I did with Emily Post, what was going on in the larger culture.
But what I meant was their personalities. Did you
So I didn't.
see any?
The personalities of the two, were they similar, or was there something that drew me that I responded to in both of them? And I guess I would say that they both were, the one thing I would say was similar was they both were so passionate about, not even passionate, they were driven to do their own work, that they were what we would call workaholics. And even though they were social people, both of them, and well-liked, what they most always wanted to do was to get back to work. That would be what I would say.